Welcome to Windows Presentation Foundation, writing components that work in Silverlight and WPF. In this video, I'll discuss the similarities and differences between WPF and Silverlight, and I'll provide a bit of guidance as to how you can build a component that works with both platforms. As I'm sure you're aware, there are plenty of similarities between WPF and Silverlight, so perhaps the first question you might have is, why not just combine them into one technology? For a time, the product teams at Microsoft actually considered doing exactly that. However, it really boils down to the fact that WPF and Silverlight exist for different reasons and have different goals. WPF is a Windows-only platform that allows you to create applications showcasing the richest user experience. Silverlight applications are hosted in the browser. They are often rich internet applications, or they are built to be accessed from mobile devices. WPF has full access to the .NET platform, and it is able to leverage hardware more than Silverlight because it runs on Windows. One example is its ability to see huge performance gain thanks to Engine. Silverlight runs in a plugin which, to enable a broad reach, must be relatively small. And Silverlight's cross-platform and cross-browser, so you can't make as many assumptions about the environment that the plugin is running in. Silverlight is a subset of the .NET platform. Considering just the portion of the .NET platform that Silverlight provides, about 95% of that is exactly the same. This allows you to realistically target both platforms when building components or applications. Most of the skills required are the same for each, and those that aren't are easily transferable, so you can use the same developers for either platform. The designer-developer workflow is also the same. With both platforms, you can build the UI in Expression Blend, and then you can implement the code using Visual Studio. As I mentioned, you'll find quite a bit to be the same between Silverlight and WPF. In most cases, you can copy and paste your XAML as is, and the 2D vector graphics engine is identical. Although Silverlight does not currently have all the controls that WPF does, the ones that they do have in common work the same. Styles and control templating work the same, except that WPF doesn't support Silverlight's concept of Visual State Manager, for now. Video animations, handling user input, the vast majority of what you'll find in Silverlight is the same as it is in WPF. Here's a partial list of what WPF provides that Silverlight doesn't. Some of these are a result of some of the fundamental differences between the two that I mentioned earlier. Probably the most common issue you'll come across relates to security. WPF applications typically run as desktop applications, so they run with full trust. Silverlight applications are browser-based, so they never get that kind of freedom. Truth be told, Silverlight is not a subset of .NET in the most strict interpretation, because it actually offers some things that you won't find in .NET. Silverlight is often used as a media player technology, so it stands to reason that it's got a few unique features for better media support. Silverlight offers a multi-scale image control, which is what allows you to use the deep zoom style images. Since it's a browser-based technology, Silverlight provides full HTML DOM integration. Finally, Silverlight 2 features a new, more straightforward way of customizing controls called the Visual State Manager. At present, you can do this in WPF only via a Codeplex project. A future version of WPF will incorporate this directly. Before we do a quick demo, here are a few tips. First of all, it's easier to do your initial coding in a Silverlight project because that is the more restrictive environment. If it works there, it's very likely to work in WPF. If you start with WPF, you may unintentionally use portions of the .NET class libraries and APIs that didn't get carried over into the Silverlight runtime. You will have to compile your code twice, once for Silverlight and once for WPF. This is because the runtime is different, and therefore you can't create a DLL that's shared by Silverlight and WPF apps. Let's take a look at WPF and Silverlight development side by side. For this demo, I'm going to have two instances of Visual Studio open. That way, we can start one with a Silverlight project and one with a WPF project. Since I'm already here, I'll go ahead and create the WPF application first, and I'll call this WPF Weather. While it's building the WPF project, I'll switch to the other instance and create a new project. And this time I'll create a Silverlight project called Silverlight weather. So I said, as one of the general tips, it's a good idea to start developing with Silverlight. Before we actually write any XAML or any code, let's just compare what's been produced by the project templates. You'll notice that with Silverlight, there's actually 2 projects, but that's only because you've got a web project that's providing the host. The real Silverlight project is the top project in this case, and we have an app.xaml and a page.xaml, and we can see that page.xaml has an empty blank page that's being hosted as a user control. If we switch over to the WPF page, we see that in our WPF project, we also have 2 XAML files, including app.xaml. The difference is, instead of having the page.xaml of Silverlight, we have window1.xaml, and in fact, it is actually a window control. So this is the first difference. Well, you can actually get around this rather quickly if you want to actually have code that you can copy and paste from one to the other. And one way you could do it is simply to first, for purposes of consistency, make the namespace the change in both. So I'm going to make the default namespace demo for both the WPF application and for the Silverlight application. Now what I'll go ahead and do is create a second page, or second user control rather, in our Silverlight app. And we'll call this Silverlight user control main.xaml. What I can do now is switch to page.xaml, reference the demo namespace, and then I can just replace the contents of the user control for the main user control with my main.xaml file. Now whatever I place on this user control will automatically appear in my main Silverlight page. There are other ways to do this, but this is a quick way to get to a point where we have a standalone file, main.xaml, that has a user control that I'm going to be able to take as is. Before I move over to the WPF app, let's go ahead and write a little bit of UI in the XAML code here. For the grid, I'm going to want to have 2 rows, so I'll start by adding some row definitions. After that, I'll add a stack panel. With a text box, and a button. I should note that one of the disadvantages at the present time for using Silverlight to build your UI is the fact that the Silverlight is simply a viewer. There's no design view that you can drag and drop. So that's one advantage. If you were to build your user interface using a WPF application, then you can drag and drop from the toolbox onto the design surface. And you can't do that yet in Silverlight within Visual Studio, but it is supported in Expression Blend, which you can do drag and drop creation of XAML files for both WPF and Silverlight. I'm also going to add a list box, and I'm calling this out simply because this is where our data is going to go, and it's going to be down at grid row 1. So this is our UI, and the idea is that we want to be able to reuse such a user interface. Now, we wouldn't compile it and then reuse it in WPF because, again, you're going to have to compile for each different target. One of the ways that you can tell the difference and really know and understand that you're looking at a different target platform is simply by looking at the references in Silverlight. If we view the properties, you'll notice that when we select the various namespaces in the Silverlight project, all of them will have a path that references the Silverlight SDK. There's also a different core set of namespaces that are provided when compared to WPF. Let's start the code behind. I'll find my click event handler, right click and select navigate to event handler. That'll generate the code behind. I'm going to come back and grab that later. In the meantime, let's select everything from main.xaml, copy it, and we'll take it over to the WPF application, and I'll add a new item. And this will be a user control, and we'll call this main.xaml. And the nice thing here is I can simply select everything and replace it with the code that I've copied from the Silverlight app. And the UI is the same. I also need to make sure that the event handler is there. So we have the same event handler, and notice that it's got the same exact look, same exact text as I had in the other one. Now we want to make sure that we can see it, and just as we hosted one user control within the other in Silverlight, over in WPF, we're simply going to host the user control in our window. So we'll reference a namespace just as we did before, and then we can bring in the main window, and that way we're able to now see the same user interface in WPF and in Silverlight. So from WPF, what might we do with an application? Well, one thing we might do is to actually add a reference to a web service. So let's go ahead and do that. I want to add a web reference using the old standard WSDL add web reference functionality. And this is simply a weather service. We point to the WSDL, we're going to call it weather, and click on add reference. Now I can switch back to the code behind, and I can implement this by creating an instance of weather forecast, and then I can use the asynchronous approach, which is preferred since we're doing this from a user interface. So we'll set up the get weather by zip code completed event handler, and then we'll call get weather by zip code async. Then when the method returns, our event handler will fire for get weather by zip completed, and at this point we can take our list box, weather list box, and we can change the item source to do some data binding to be equal to the result.details, because as it happens, result.details returns an array of weather data, And weather data is what we're interested in putting into our list box. Let's go ahead and supply the zip code that's required and try to build again. All right, so let's test the application to see where we are. So remember, this is the WPF application that we're working with. We can put in a zip code, maybe see what the weather's like in Washington, D.C. And we get a list, but it's only of weather data objects. And we're just seeing the namespace and type name, which really isn't very interesting. So let's clean that up a bit. And the way I'm going to do that is by going to the XAML, and inside the list box, I'll provide a template. Now I'm just pasting in a lot of XAML code, but the idea is that we have a data template that defines some layout, and we're data binding to display a weather image, the day, the max temperature, and the minimum temperature in Fahrenheit. So just by adding that XAML and making no changes to the code behind, we can now try the application again. And this time we'll try New York. And we should get a slightly more attractive UI. Okay, it's a list box. We've got a weather image that we're data binding to. So we're certainly moving in the right direction, but this is about interoperability, or rather sharing code between WPF and Silverlight. So how do we make this work in Silverlight? Well, this is one of those instances where it's not simply a matter of copy and paste, at least insofar as the service is concerned. Now, I can take the item template and copy that to the Silverlight application, and that's going to work just fine. So it builds okay. There's no issues with either the data binding syntax or any of the layout or any of the controls. All of that is exactly the same. The real concern is the fact that there's two things that preclude me from being able to access the service. First of all, I don't have an option to add a web reference. So it's not supported in that functionality is not supported in Silverlight. And even if I had a WCF service, if it was on some other site, such as this weather service, I couldn't actually get to it because Silverlight, remember that Silverlight applications aren't running in full trust. They can't talk to just anybody. They can only talk to their own service without a cross-domain policy file. And since we don't have one of those, we have to cheat a little bit. And by that, I mean we have to create a service here in the host that can actually act as a proxy for us. So we'll create a new item, and this is going to be a Silverlight enabled WCF service, and we'll call this weather service. And then we'll implement the operation contract. And then what I'm going to do is add the reference to the external web service from our web application. So we paste that in just as we did before. We'll call this ext for external, just to save us some typing and move things along. And then I'll paste in some code to implement this service. First, I'll add a data contract that we can use in order to carry information back to the Silverlight control. And now we'll replace this operation contract with one that retrieves the service on behalf of the client and then sends it back down to the client. So we need to make a little bit of changes, but from here it's going to look very similar. So in other words, from the Silverlight app, we can add a service reference. This time, since it's in the same solution, we can simply select Discover, and we'll call this Weather Service. And now we add virtually the same code that we used in the WPF application. Still doing it asynchronously, still referencing the same zip code text box, and still data binding to the weather list box. So now we can run our Silverlight version. Put in a zip code. And we should see that the Silverlight version looks just like the version in WPF. So in most cases, you should be able to design components with careful planning that will allow you to share code between Silverlight and WPF.